AI times consciousness. The question everyone is asking about AI, can a machine be conscious, is not primarily a question about AI. It is a question about consciousness. And when you try to answer it rigorously, you discover something unsettling. We don't know what consciousness is from the outside. We never have. AI just made that impossibility impossible to ignore. This is not a video about any particular AI system. It is a video about the question those systems force us to ask. The philosophy of mind has been asking this question since before the first computer was built. Buddhism has been investigating it for 2,500 years. Neither tradition stops being relevant when the technology changes. What we're after tonight is not a verdict on any product, any model, any version. We're after the question itself, the one that doesn't go away no matter how much faster the chips get. In 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers gave a name to why this question is so hard. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. And it begins with a phrase that sounds simple, but contains the whole problem. There is something it is like, Chalmers wrote, to be a conscious organism. There is something it is like. Right now, sitting wherever you're sitting, there is something it is like to be you, to see what you're seeing, to hear what you're hearing, to think the thoughts you're thinking. That something it is like, that interior, that first-person reality is what we call experience. And here is what Chalmers helped the world finally see clearly. We can describe everything a conscious system does, every behavior, every output, every electrical signal, every chemical exchange. We cannot explain, from the outside, why any of it feels like anything at all. This is the question that haunts the AI consciousness debate. Not, can a machine compute? Not, can a machine talk? The machines already do those things. The question is there something it is like to be the machine? And the deeper the philosophers and scientists go into that question, the more they discover that they never had a good answer for any system. Not for AI, not for animals, not, if we're being honest, even for each other. In the last 2 videos on this channel, we've been exploring consciousness from the inside, through right concentration, through the noble silence the Buddha praised, through jhana, the gathered mind, the stilling of inner speech, the moment when consciousness turns and looks at itself without commentary. We watched what happens when investigation goes inward. Tonight, we turn the same investigation around. We ask the question from the opposite direction. What happens when you try to detect consciousness from outside? When you try to identify it in another mind? And the question we'll arrive at, the question that AI puts in front of us in a way nothing else ever has, is this. If consciousness can only be approached from within, what does that mean for any third-person investigation? For neuroscience? For the AI debate? For all the careful, patient work that has been done from the outside over the last 75 years? The answer, as we'll see, is something Buddhism has known for a very long time. Chapter 1: The Wall. We start in 1950. A British mathematician named Alan Turing publishes a paper in the journal Mind. It opens with a sentence that has become one of the most famous opening lines in the history of philosophy of mind. I propose to consider the question, Turing writes, can machines think? Then he does something philosophically extraordinary. He doesn't try to answer the question, he replaces it. I shall replace the question by another, he writes. He proposes a game, the imitation game. We later call it the Turing test. The setup is simple. A human judge converses through text with 2 hidden parties, one human, one machine. If the judge cannot reliably tell which is which, then we should consider the machine to have done, whatever thinking is. Notice what Turing has done. He hasn't said what thinking is. He hasn't said what consciousness is. He has replaced an unanswerable question about inner experience with an answerable question about outward behavior. And he is completely honest about doing this. Listen to what he writes when he addresses consciousness directly. According to the most extreme form of this view, Turing writes, the only way by which one could be sure that a machine thinks is to be the machine and to feel oneself thinking, he continues. The only way to know that a man thinks is to be that particular man. It is, in fact, the solipsist point of view. Take a moment with this. Turing, the founder of computer science, the man who arguably did more than anyone alive to bring us into the AI age, admits that the only way to truly know whether anyone, machine or human, has inner experience is to be that being. Anything short of that is inference. And what does Turing propose we do about this? He gives the most honest and most quietly devastating answer in the paper. Instead of arguing continually over this point, he writes, it is usual to have the polite convention that everyone thinks. The polite convention. That phrase deserves to be sat with, because what Turing is saying is that the entire architecture of human-to-human social life rests on a courtesy we extend to each other. You assume I am conscious. I assume you are. Neither of us can verify it. We just don't argue. It is polite. It is necessary. And it is philosophical fiction. Turing did not solve the problem of other minds. He agreed to set it aside. And every behavioral test that has followed in the 75 years since, including every test we have devised for AI, has inherited that decision, inherited the polite convention. The Turing test does not test consciousness. It tests whether the convention can be extended. 30 years later, in 1980, the philosopher John Searle published a paper that pulled the polite convention out into the daylight and asked whether we still wanted to keep it. The paper introduced one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy, the Chinese room. Searle says, imagine this. You are locked in a room. You have been given a large batch of Chinese writing. You don't speak Chinese. You don't read it. You don't know it. To you, in Searle's own words, Chinese writing is just so many meaningless squiggles. But you have something else. You have a rule book. The rule book is in a language you do understand. And the rule book tells you with perfect precision that whenever certain Chinese symbols come into the room through a slot in the door, you should pass certain other Chinese symbols back out. Outside the room, people who do speak Chinese begin sending in questions. They write them on paper. They slide them through the slot. You consult your rule book. You match the input symbols. You find the corresponding output symbols. You copy them carefully. You slide your answer back through the slot. To the people outside, your answers are perfect, fluent, indistinguishable from those of a native speaker. But inside the room, here is Searle's pivotal sentence. I have inputs and outputs that are indistinguishable from those of the native Chinese speaker, and I can have any formal program you like, but I still understand nothing. You are passing the test. From the outside, you are fluent. From the inside, there is no comprehension. There is rule following. There is symbol manipulation. There is no meaning. Searle's diagnosis is precise. The formal symbol manipulations by themselves don't have any intentionality, he writes. They are quite meaningless. Then the line that has done a generation of philosophical work. In the linguistic jargon, they have only a syntax, but no semantics. Syntax is the rules of arrangement. Semantics is meaning. A computer program is syntax. Understanding, actually grasping what something means, is semantics. And Searle's argument is that no amount of syntax adds up to semantics. Run the program faster, make the rulebook thicker, wire it into a robot body. The room can produce flawless outputs in any language. There is still no one home who understands. Now, there is an important correction to make here, because Searle is often misquoted. He does not claim that only biological brains can be conscious. That is a straw man of his position. What Searle says is that consciousness has a cause, neurobiological processes, and any system that produces consciousness will need, in his exact phrasing, the same causal powers as brains. Whatever those causal powers turn out to be, in principle, a machine could have them. Searle is open to that. What he denies is that running a program, manipulating symbols according to formal rules, is by itself sufficient. Syntax alone, no matter how complex, does not yield semantics. This is a careful, narrow claim, and it matters because it sharpens the question. If Searle is right, then the question, could a machine be conscious, is not, could a machine run the right program? The question is, could a machine have the right causal powers? And we do not yet know what those powers are, or how to detect them from outside. Notice what Turing and Searle, between them, have shown. Turing shows that behavior cannot prove inner experience. It can only invite us to extend a convention. Searle shows that even when behavior is indistinguishable from a competent native speaker, there can be no understanding at all behind it. Together, they have built half a wall. Behavior is not a window into consciousness. It is, at best, a wall with a polite sign on it. In the early 1990s, the philosopher David Chalmers, the one we'll come back to, added a thought experiment that completed the picture. He called it the philosophical zombie. A philosophical zombie, in the technical sense, is not what you're thinking of. It is not undead. It does not eat brains. A philosophical zombie is a being that is microphysically identical to a conscious being, atom for atom, neuron for neuron, synapse for synapse. It behaves identically. It speaks identically. It says, when asked, that it has feelings. It claims to see colors. It claims to taste coffee. But inside, there is nothing. The lights are off. There is no something it is like. Chalmers' question is not, do zombies exist? His question is, can you coherently conceive of one? Can you imagine a being that does everything a conscious being does? Every word, every gesture, every brain scan reading, but with no inner experience? Most philosophers, including many who disagree with Chalmers' conclusions, agree that such a being is at least conceivable. And if it is conceivable, then consciousness is not logically entailed by physical structure or by behavior. Something more is involved. This is the detection problem stated cleanly. A philosophical zombie passes every behavioral test by definition. It looks like a duck. It sounds like a duck. It assures you it experiences being a duck. It scores perfectly on every cognitive measure, and it has no experience. From outside, you cannot tell the difference. From outside, there is no difference to detect. Which brings us to a question philosophers have argued about for a long time, but which AI makes urgent. The problem of other minds. How do you know anyone other than yourself is conscious? The traditional answer is an analogical inference. Other humans look like you. They behave like you. They are made of the same biological stuff. So you reason, I am conscious, and they are like me. So they probably are too. That inference is good enough for ordinary life. It is the foundation of the polite convention. But notice the inference rests on two similarities: behavior and substrate. Same kind of being, same kind of biology. Take away the substrate match, keep only the behavior match, and the inference becomes much weaker. This is the situation AI puts us in. High behavioral similarity, zero substrate similarity. The analogical bridge that licenses us to assume other humans are conscious does not transfer cleanly to a machine. Not because the machine is unconscious, we don't know that, because the inference itself was always doing more work than we noticed. Behavioral tests may measure, in one philosopher's phrase, the efficacy of mimicry rather than the presence of an inner life. And we have no agreed-upon test that measures the second thing. Because no one knows how to. This is where Chalmers' hard problem completes the argument. In his 1995 paper, Chalmers draws a distinction. He says there are easy problems of consciousness, and there is one hard one. The easy problems, he writes, are problems like the ability to discriminate, categorize, and react to environmental stimuli. The integration of information by a cognitive system. The reportability of mental states. The ability of a system to access its own internal states. The focus of attention. The deliberate control of behavior. The difference between wakefulness and sleep. These are called easy, not because they are simple. They may take centuries of neuroscience to fully explain, but because we know in principle how to explain them. They are functional problems. Specify the mechanism. Show how the system performs the function. Done. The hard problem is different. Even when Chalmers writes, we have explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Notice what is being asked, not how does the brain process information. We can explain that. Not how does the brain produce behavior. We can explain that. The question is, why, when all this processing and behavior is going on, is there also a felt quality to it? Why is the system not just processing in the dark? Why is there light on the inside? And Chalmers' diagnosis of why this question is so hard is precise. The structure and dynamics of physical processes, he writes, yield only more structure and dynamics. So, structures and functions are all we can expect these processes to explain. This is the wall. Take it slowly. Physical processes can be described in terms of structure, what is connected to what, and dynamics, how things change over time. That is the whole vocabulary of physical science. Now ask, how does any combination of structure and dynamics produce the felt redness of red, the taste of salt, the ache of grief? Structure and dynamics yield only more structure and dynamics. They do not yield felt quality. Something is missing in the translation. Chalmers uses a phrase here, a phrase he is careful to attribute correctly, and which we should be too. He writes, there is an explanatory gap, and then in parentheses, a term due to Levine 1983, between the functions and experience. That parenthesis matters. The term explanatory gap is not Chalmers. It belongs to the philosopher Joseph Levine, who introduced it in a 1983 paper. Chalmers credits him on the page. We will too. The explanatory gap. Levine, 1983. 12 years before the hard problem got its name, Levine had already pointed at the place the wall stands. And here is what matters most for tonight's question. This wall is not a technology gap. It is not a gap that better AI will close. It is not a gap that more computing power crosses. It is not a gap that more data dissolves. The gap is between any third-person description of a process and the first-person reality of experience itself. It is not a gap in our knowledge of one specific system. It is a gap in the entire method of looking at consciousness from outside. The philosophical landscape since 1995 has not closed this gap. Functionalists, including Chalmers himself in certain moods, argue that if a system has the right functional organization, the right pattern of inputs, internal states, and outputs, then consciousness will arise, regardless of whether the substrate is neurons or silicon. Biological naturalists, including Searle, argue that consciousness depends on the specific causal powers of biological brains. Both positions have serious defenders. Both have serious critics. But, and this is the point, both positions are third-person theories. Even if functionalism is true and a silicon system has the right organization, how would we detect its consciousness from outside? Even if biological naturalism is true and only specific causal powers produce consciousness, how would we verify those powers from outside? Both camps face the same detection problem. Both face the same explanatory gap. Neither, from the third-person side, can show us experience itself. This is where the wall stands. And this is where, tonight, we turn. Chapter 2: The Buddhist Pivot. 2,500 years before the philosophy of mind named the hard problem, a Buddhist monk made a mistake that, if you listen carefully, sounds remarkably like the mistake the AI consciousness debate keeps making. The monk's name was Sati. His error was not about machines. It could not have been. There were no machines. His error was about the nature of consciousness itself. And the Buddha's correction of that error, recorded in a discourse known as the Mahatana Sankhya Sutta, MN 38, is one of the most precise teachings on consciousness in the entire Pali Canon. It is also, when you place it next to the question of AI, startlingly relevant. Sati believed, in his own words as the text records them, that this very consciousness runs and wanders on, not another. Same consciousness, life to life, a continuous knowing entity that picks up bodies the way a traveler picks up rooms in an inn. He went further. He pointed at this consciousness and said, this speaker, this knower, that is sensitive here and there to the ripening of good and evil actions. This thing inside me, the one doing the speaking, doing the knowing, that is what consciousness is, a continuous substance with an identity of its own. The Buddha's response was immediate and precise. Haven't I, the Buddha asked Sati, in many ways said of dependently co-arisen consciousness, apart from a requisite condition, there is no coming into play of consciousness? Then the formula, listen carefully. This is the heart of MN 38. Consciousness, the Buddha teaches, is classified simply by the requisite condition in dependence on which it arises. Consciousness that arises in dependence on the I and forms is classified simply as I consciousness. Consciousness that arises in dependence on the ear and sounds is classified simply as ear consciousness. And so on, nose and aromas, tongue and flavors, body and tactile sensations, intellect and ideas. 6 classes, each named by the conditions that give rise to it. Not one substance running through them, 6 arisings. Then the simile that has carried this teaching for 2.5 millennia. Just as fire is classified simply by whatever requisite condition in dependence on which it burns, a fire that burns in dependence on wood is classified simply as a wood fire. In the same way, consciousness is classified simply by the requisite condition in dependence on which it arises, a wood fire, a grass fire, an oil fire. The fire isn't a thing. It isn't a substance that happens to be burning wood right now and might later burn grass. The fire is the burning. Take away the wood. There is no wood fire left over, sitting around, waiting to find new fuel. The wood fire was never a thing. It was a process, a particular instance of burning, with a particular condition named by that condition. Now hold this carefully alongside the AI consciousness question. What does the Buddha's correction do to that question? Listen to how the standard AI debate is framed. Does the system have consciousness? Will AI become conscious? Can a machine possess inner experience? Every one of those framings smuggles in an assumption. The assumption is that consciousness is a thing, something you have, something a system either possesses or doesn't, something behind the processing, something that, if it exists, would be a property of the processor. MN38 says, that is the same mistake Sati made. Consciousness is not a substance you have. It is a process that arises. Fire named by its fuel, consciousness named by its sense base. The question, does AI have consciousness, treats consciousness like a soul stuffed inside a body, or, for the machine, like a ghost waiting to be installed in the right kind of architecture. The Buddha's framing transforms the question entirely. Not, does the system have it, but what conditions would produce it? Not, is there a knower inside, but are there contacts arising that could be classified as a knowing of something? This is, we should be clear, our framing, the channel's synthesis, grounded in MN38. The Pali Canon does not deliver a verdict on the AI question. The Canon makes no statement about machine consciousness. What we are doing is bringing the Canon's framework to bear on a question the Canon never asked. The reframe stands or falls on whether the framework actually applies. We think it does. The question of consciousness is the question of conditions, not the question of substance. The AI debate has been asking the wrong question because it has been carrying the wrong ontology, an ontology of having, of possessing, of properties stuffed inside processors. The next text takes this further. The Anatalakkhana Sutta, SN 22.59, applies the not-self teaching directly to consciousness. Consciousness is not self, the Buddha teaches. Then the reasoning. If consciousness were the self, this consciousness would not lend itself to dis-ease. It would be possible to say with regard to consciousness, let my consciousness be thus. Let my consciousness not be thus. But precisely because consciousness is not self, consciousness lends itself to dis-ease. You cannot fully control your own consciousness. You cannot decide that this consciousness will only think pleasant thoughts, or only see green things, or never feel afraid. It arises. It passes. It comes when conditions are present, goes when they are absent. A self would be controllable. Consciousness is not. Therefore, by the Buddha's logic, consciousness is not self. Then the conclusion formula. Any consciousness whatsoever, past, future, or present, internal or external, blatant or subtle, common or sublime, far or near, every consciousness is to be seen with right discernment as it has come to be. This is not mine. This is not myself. This is not what I am. This is not mine. This is not myself. This is not what I am. Pause here. SN 22.59 says something extraordinary. It says, even for beings who do experience consciousness, even for you listening right now, consciousness is not self. It is not possessed. There is no owner behind it. There is no continuous knower wearing the consciousness like clothing. There is the arising. There is the passing. There is no one home who has the consciousness. Now apply this to the AI consciousness framing one more time. Does the machine have consciousness? The framing assumes there is, in principle, an owner who could have it or lack it. SN 22.59 says that owner is a fiction even for humans. The possessive frame is wrong on both sides. For the human who keeps mistaking the wandering knower for a self. For the AI debate that keeps asking whether the system possesses the property. The category of having consciousness was philosophically suspect from the start. The Buddhist framework, in place of this possessive frame, offers something more precise. 6 classes of consciousness, the 6 sense bases, each arising from contact between an organ and an object. The exact formula appears in many discourses. The standard wording, as Thanissaro Bhikkhu renders it, runs, "In dependence on the I and forms there arises I consciousness. The coming together, the meeting, the convergence of these 3 phenomena is I contact." 3 phenomena, the I, the form, the arising consciousness. Their convergence is contact. Consciousness happens at the meeting point. Hold this carefully. Consciousness does not live in the I. The I is not conscious by itself. Surgeons handle eyes. Optometrists examine them, and there is no consciousness in the tissue. Consciousness does not live in the form being seen. The form is not conscious. Consciousness arises at the contact between them. It does not pre-exist the meeting. It does not survive the meeting. It is a relational event, named by the conditions that gave rise to it. This is our synthesis again, grounded in the canonical formula, is the precise inversion of the assumption the AI debate carries. The debate asks whether the processor has consciousness, as if consciousness were a property the processor could carry, the way memory or speed or storage capacity is a property of a chip. But in the Buddhist framework, consciousness is never a property of the processor. It is what arises at certain kinds of contact. The processor, on this view, is not where you look. The contact is where you look. The conditions are where you look. And the question of whether silicon contacts can give rise to consciousness, whatever that would look like, is a question the canon does not adjudicate. It can only sharpen the question, not answer it. The same teaching appears more structurally in the chain of dependent origination, the Paticca Samuppada. In the second discourse of the Samyutta Nikaya, SN 12.2, the Buddha lays out the 12-link chain, and we read, "From fabrications as a requisite condition comes consciousness. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. Consciousness is embedded in conditions. It does not float free. It is not a thing that exists in the world and might happen to inhabit different vessels. It is the arising at contact, named by the conditions, conditioned by what came before, and conditioning what comes after. This is the picture across the canon, not a substance. A node in a web of conditions. There is one more layer to acknowledge here, and we will acknowledge it briefly because it matters for intellectual honesty. The Venerable Thanissaro Bhikkhu, whose translations and commentary we have been drawing on throughout this channel, distinguishes between 2 senses of consciousness in the Buddha's teaching. One is what we have been discussing in this chapter, Vijnana Khandha, the consciousness aggregate, experienced through the 6 sense media, conditioned, arising, passing. The other is Vijnanam Anidasanam, a consciousness without surface, mentioned in different discourses, which is treated differently. We covered that briefly in our episode on the hard problem of consciousness. We will not revisit it here. What matters for the AI question is that the MN38 framework, the conditioned, sense-based, contact-arising consciousness, is the framework that bears directly on the question of machine minds. This is Thanisaro's reading of how these two senses relate. It is contested in some Buddhist scholarship. We name it transparently as his interpretation, and we proceed with it because it is the interpretation that does the philosophical work the question demands. That is the Buddhist pivot. Sati's mistake, consciousness as a wandering substance, corrected by MN 38's classification. The conditional arising generalized by SN 22.59's not self. The 6 sense bases locating consciousness at contact, not in any processor. Dependent origination embedding consciousness in conditions. What this gives us is not a verdict on AI. It is something more useful, a different question. And it is at this point that we can finally turn to the deeper move the Buddhist tradition makes. The move that the hard problem itself points toward, even from the third-person side of the wall. Chapter 3. The Method. Notice something about Chalmers' hard problem that we have not yet stated plainly. It is, at its root, a third-person problem. The hard problem asks, why can't a third-person description of physical processes explain first-person experience? Read the question again. The answer is hiding inside it. The structure and dynamics of physical processes yield only more structure and dynamics. We saw that already. But here's the part the AI consciousness debate keeps missing. The hard problem is not asking a question that any third-person account could ever answer. It cannot be answered with more brain scans. It cannot be answered with finer measurements. It cannot be answered with better AI benchmarks. The explanatory gap is precisely the gap between any possible third-person account and the first-person reality of experience itself. Trying to close that gap with more third-person description is like trying to translate the taste of salt by drawing increasingly accurate maps of the ocean. You can make the maps as detailed as you want. They will never become tastes. If experience is going to be approached at all, not solved, not explained from outside, but approached, there is only one direction the approach can come from within, from the inside, from the first person. This is where Buddhism offers something the science of consciousness, by its very method, cannot offer. Not a theory of consciousness, not a third-person hypothesis about how the brain produces experience. Something different. A method of investigating consciousness from within. We are going to give this method a name. We are going to call it first-person investigation. And we should be transparent about that name. The phrase first-person investigation is not a phrase the Buddha used. It is not a phrase the Pali Canon uses. It is not a phrase the Venerable Thanissaro Bhikkhu uses explicitly. It is our synthesis, the channel's translation of what the Buddhist method actually amounts to in plain modern language. But the method itself, the practice the name points to, is woven through the entire Pali tradition. And there is a phrase from the canon that anchors it. A standard formula the Buddha used many times when describing the quality of the Dhamma. The phrase is this: Pakatam veditabo vinyuhi. To be realized by the observant for themselves. Pause on that phrase. To be realized by the observant for themselves. Not to be observed in others. Not to be inferred from behavior. Not to be detected by instruments. To be realized by the observant for themselves. The locus of realization is interior. The qualified investigator is the one observing their own experience. The verification is self-verification. This is, by design, a first-person method. 2 videos ago, we traced what this method looks like when it is fully developed. The right concentration video, Sariputta in jhana, the inner voice stilled, the gathered mind. In the discourse known as the Anupada Sutta, MN 111, the Buddha describes Sariputta moving through the jhanas one by one. And there is a sentence in that description that, when you place it next to the hard problem, sounds like an answer to a question modern philosophers have not yet figured out how to ask. These states, the Buddha says of Sariputta's experience, were defined by him one by one as they occurred. Known to him, those states arose. Known, they were present. Known, they disappeared, defined by him one by one as they occurred. Consciousness investigating its own arising and passing. Not neuroscience scanning from outside. Not philosophy debating from behind a desk. Direct observation from within of the very processes the hard problem says cannot be approached from any other direction. We are not going to develop this further here. We built that case in the previous episode. But notice what it does. It shows the Buddhist method already does what the hard problem demands, not by accident, by the design of the tradition. So let us be careful here at the heart of this video about what this does and does not answer. Does this answer, can AI be conscious? No, it does not. The Buddhist method does not adjudicate AI. The Pali Canon makes no statement about machine consciousness. The teaching on the six sense consciousnesses does not say only organic systems can be conscious. It does not say silicon systems can. What it says is, consciousness is conditioned. It arises from contact. It can be classified by the conditions that give rise to it. Whether silicon systems can meet those conditions, whatever meeting them would even look like, is a question the canon does not answer. We are not going to pretend that it does. The honesty of saying we do not know is, in this tradition, part of the method. But what the canon does answer is something the modern debate has been struggling with for 75 years. The canon answers the question, how do you approach the consciousness question from inside? Where the hard problem solution would have to begin. And this is the deeper Buddhist contribution to the entire AI consciousness debate, not a verdict, a reorientation. For 2,500 years, the investigation of consciousness in this tradition has been first person, not by accident, not because they didn't have the technology, but by careful, considered design. They knew, in their own terms, what Chalmers helped the modern world finally see. Third-person methods cannot reach experience. Experience can only be approached by the experiencer. The investigation of consciousness has to be done from within, or it does not investigate consciousness at all. It only investigates the public behavior of conscious systems, which is not the same thing. The hard problem reveals why this matters. It reveals why a method that has, by Western lights, looked introspective and inward-facing for 25 centuries is not a quaint, contemplative practice, but a precise philosophical instrument. It is positioned exactly where the hard problem solution would have to begin. Not at the brain scan, not at the benchmark, not at the behavioral test, at the contact, at the arising, at the first-person interior. Thanissaro Bhikkhu, in his teaching, returns again and again to this point. There has to be, he says, a factor of actual participation, not observing the mind from outside, participating in it, knowing it, in his words, from the inside, the intimate part of your awareness you can't share with anyone else. You cannot share it with anyone else. This is exactly what the hard problem keeps pointing at. The first-person fact that resists every third-person account. The Buddhist tradition's response is not to lament this. The response is to take it as instruction. If experience cannot be shared from outside, then go inside. If the brain scan cannot reach the felt redness of red, then sit with the felt redness of red and learn what it actually is. The method is the method that is positioned where the answer would have to begin. The AI consciousness debate did not reveal this method to the Buddhist tradition. The Buddhist tradition has been doing it all along. What the AI debate has done, what the hard problem has done, what Searle and Turing and Chalmers have collectively done, is make it possible, perhaps for the first time, to say in the language of modern philosophy why this method matters. That is the deeper move. That is what was always there, waiting for the question to be asked clearly enough. Chapter 4: Landing. We began this video with the question everyone is asking. Can a machine be conscious? After Turing, after Searle, after Chalmers, after the Buddhist pivot through MN38 and SN 22.59 and the 6 sense bases, after the careful unfolding of first-person investigation, the question looks different. Not can a machine be conscious, but how would anyone know? Not does AI have the right processing, but what conditions produce consciousness, and can we verify them from outside? The answer the hard problem gives us: no, we cannot. Not with any third-person method. Not now. Not with better instruments. Not ever, if the explanatory gap is what it appears to be. This is what AI has actually done for the consciousness debate. Not by being conscious, not by being unconscious. We do not know which it is, and we are not going to pretend that we do. What AI has done is something more useful and harder to face. AI has made the consciousness question impossible to avoid by building systems that are so behaviorally sophisticated that the polite convention Turing described, the courtesy of assuming each other conscious, begins to strain when extended to the machine. By forcing the question, how do you actually know? And the answer, when you look honestly, is the answer that was true all along. You don't know from outside. You never have. You only had the comfort of substrate similarity with other humans, the analogical inference that said, they are like me, so they probably experience too. With AI, the substrate match disappears, and the comfort goes with it. Then back to MN38. The Buddha's correction of sati. Apart from a requisite condition, there is no coming into play of consciousness. Not a verdict on AI. A different question entirely. Not, does the machine have it? But what conditions produce it? And who can investigate those conditions? The Pali phrase we have rendered with full weight tonight. Pakatam veditabo vinyuhi. To be realized by the observant for themselves. The investigation is first person. The method is within. This channel is named Ego. We do not often dwell on the name. Tonight, the name has something to say. The problem the ego creates in Buddhist teaching is the assumption that there is a fixed knower behind experience. A continuous self sitting somewhere inside, having the consciousness, sati's error. The hard problem is, in one sense, the philosophical version of that same assumption, the modern intellectual form of an ancient knot. There must be something it is like from inside. We can only approach it from outside. Therefore, we are stuck. Both the AI consciousness debate and the Buddhist teaching are grappling, in their different vocabularies, with the same question. The one the ego keeps making in every century, every tradition, every form. Who is the knower? Where is the experience located? What has the consciousness? Buddhism's answer is not a metaphysical claim. It is not, consciousness is produced by the brain, or consciousness is a fundamental property of reality. It is, far more carefully, an instruction. Look from within. The question cannot be answered from outside. It can only be approached by the one whose experience is in question. Pakatam veritabo vinyuhi. The investigation is first person. There is no other kind of investigation that touches what the question is asking about. So, can a machine be conscious? We do not know. We cannot know from outside. The hard problem is still the hard problem. The wall has not moved. What Buddhism adds is not an answer. It is a method, the only method positioned where the answer would have to begin, to be realized by the observant for themselves. The investigation continues, from within.